So welcome to our talk, 8 Hours to API Literacy, a fast, fun on-ramp for writers. Like I said, I'm Michelle Fredette. I work at New Relic, which is a company that enables software instrumentation and monitoring. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Chris Cowell, former developer, currently a independent technical trainer based in Portland, Oregon.
Right. So today we're going to talk about the API training that Chris provided to a group of us at tech writers, mainly also some researchers and designers at New Relic. We'll talk about why New Relic wanted the course, what we hope to get out of it, Chris's approach to training non-engineers, how the team responded to the class, and then our advice to you. First, I'm going to set the stage a little bit. The reason that we were thinking a lot about API docs in particular was that we were getting ready to revamp our developer doc site. Many of us on the team had learned our API, whatever knowledge we had, through actually documenting APIs and maybe some classes that were more aimed at engineers than at tech writers. We brought in Chris, like I said earlier, because I knew him from previous company, and he came highly recommended. I also knew that he was starting to do some training, and that he wanted to do training that was actually sort of bespoke, that it was customized for the needs of the company. What we wanted to get out of the training were a stronger footing in APIs in general. We wanted to be able to run API calls and test them out ourselves. We wanted to up-level the whole team quickly because, like I mentioned earlier, we are an agile team. And so it doesn't just fall to one or two people on the team to document APIs. We all participate in that. We also had found that we were pretty confident about creating API reference content, but much less so about other types of content, use cases or tasks around APIs. And we wanted to feel confident that the kind of tasks we might write would be the ones that were most needed. We also were unsure if our current tool chain and workflows for APIs would meet the expectations of modern users. When we talked to Chris about the class, we asked him to make sure that there would be hands-on exercises. But other than that, we didn't really stipulate any kind of pedagogical requirements. And as you'll soon learn, that's kind of funny because that was what made the class a huge success. And it really was a huge success. We'll talk about that a little later. But Chris, over to you.
Okay. So as Michelle mentioned already, this was a class that I designed and presented. It was an 8-hour class focusing on REST APIs mostly. And I built the class around 7 training principles that I've developed over the years. None of them are earth-shattering, but I think it's useful to have them kind of collected in one place and explained clearly as a way of giving you an idea of kind of what to look for when you're talking to a prospective trainer about giving you or your own team training in APIs. So what I'd like to do is walk through each principle and explain what it means, and then give an example of how it applied to the New Relic class. And Michelle is going to be driving for me, so thank you. The first principle sounds obvious, but it's surprising how often it's not honored by instructors, and that is to consider who it is you're training, who's the audience. So for example, if you're training a bunch of engineers, they're going to probably have fairly deep technical knowledge. They might have exposure to this topic to some extent already. And you would use a different set of vocabulary and a different way of explaining things at a different pace than you would if you were training people with less of a technical background, such as technical writers. So a technical writer might very well have come from a background in, say, journalism, and they might be more familiar with writing on a typewriter or a notebook than with using VI and Git. So that's an exaggeration. No one uses typewriters anymore, but you get the general point. New Relic's technical writers had kind of a mix of backgrounds, but in general, they were typical of what you'd find in technical writers. That is to say, less technical knowledge than a set of programmers, but a completely normal amount of knowledge for technical writers. So this meant I had to slow down a little bit compared to how I would explain things to engineers and make fewer assumptions about what they already knew. So this worked well with a few surprises. So if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you about one of the surprises. One of the labs we had was very simple. We wanted students to use a REST API to figure out what time the sun rose in Stockholm, Sweden this morning. So it was a two-step lab. Step one is figure out just where Stockholm is. And step two is plug in that latitude and longitude information into a REST API call. And I was surprised that about a third of the students in the class didn't realize that the lat and long variables that you see here in step two were supposed to be replaced by the information they found in step one, which, in retrospect, is totally normal. These were not programmers. They didn't have a lot of exposure to variables. How could they possibly know that they were supposed to plug in numbers in place of lat and long? Anyway, it was frustrating for them when they tried this to the best of their abilities and it didn't work. And it was kind of illuminating to me. And I then had to go rewrite the future labs, the later labs in the class, to be more explicit based on what I had just learned about the class's background. Okay, next one. Yeah, the second principle is the trainer should listen carefully to what the students want to learn. So it's very easy for a trainer to press play on an audio tape they have inside their head that contains a lecture that they've given 100 times before. But that's the low effort way of training, but it rarely matches up to what the students actually want to learn. So it's really important for the trainer to talk to the students ahead of time, or at least a representative from the students, and figure out what is your agenda that you have in mind. Now, often the students will say, I don't know. I trust you. You're the trainer. You tell me what I need to know. But it's surprising how often, if you kind of push the students to refine their interests, it's surprising how often they are able to come up with things. Now, if they really genuinely don't know, then you can advise them. Okay, Michelle, can you go to the next? So at New Relic, what happened was, initially, they said, well, what we want to do is we want to learn how to document REST APIs. Forgive the typo there. Presentation, barrel of last-minute editing. And then I talked to them a little more, and they said, well, actually, no, we don't want to know how to document REST APIs. We can figure that out on our own. We need to know what are like best practices. What are the advanced things that we should know about documenting REST APIs? And then I pushed them a little harder about what they really wanted to know. And can you advance one more, Michelle? They said, no, we don't actually want to know either of those two things. We want to take a step back and make sure our whole team is on the same page and has the same basic understanding of REST APIs. We want to know just what are REST APIs? How do you use them? What are some examples of good REST API documentation that we can use as models? And furthermore, we realize that GraphQL is kind of an up-and-coming technology at our company, and we really do need to know more about that. So GraphQL could be its own 8-hour course easily, but we did try to do a basic introduction to GraphQL. So talking with the representative from the students was a great way of refining the agenda. Third principle is we want to promote interactivity, but there are better and worse ways of doing that. And so I prefer this idea of low friction or low stress interactivity. So we all know that interactive classes tend to be the best classes. They are the most fun for everyone. You learn the best, you remember the material the best when there's sort of give and take between the teacher and the students. But interactivity is really hard to force. if an instructor says something like, hey, let's go around the room and everybody tell me your favorite pizza topping, that's one way to force interactivity, but it's not all that effective. And frankly, it strikes terror into the hearts of a lot of students who just don't like thinking on their feet or don't like being called on, for a command performance in front of a group. So what we did instead at New Relic is we had frequent scheduled breaks for questions. And those breaks would kind of morph into icebreakers, which is a technique that was a little bit experimental, but I think worked very well. So this is an example of one of the scheduled breaks. We had talked, this is a slide from the class. We had talked for 10 or 15 minutes about the request response model with REST APIs, and then paused, asked if anyone had questions. And the picture has nothing to do with REST APIs. This is Niagara Falls with the water turned off, which the US Army Corps of Engineers did in the 60s for some reason. And so we got a chance to just talk about how odd Niagara Falls looks like when it's completely dry. So ideally, students do have questions during these periods. Questions are some of the best feedback, some of the only feedback that instructors get on, number one, are students understanding the material? Number two, are they engaged and interested? And number three, do they have specific problems or specific ways of doing things in their environment that you might not have been aware of that you need to address? And number four, do you need to take an agenda detour? Do you need to change the direction of the training a little bit based on student questions? So questions are great, but often students don't really have questions. And that's why it's useful to let your brain and your eyes take a break, get off of technology, and think about something else for a while. This was another slide we had for questions. And this is, we got to talk for, 5 or 10 minutes about the spooky Blade Runner-esque area called the walled city of Kowloon in Hong Kong, which for a while was the most densely populated spot on Earth. So it was kind of a weird topic. It was a lot of fun to talk about. It had nothing to do with REST APIs. And as an icebreaker, it helped people feel comfortable just talking in the group. That sounds trivial, but it's really important to build that kind of camaraderie within the group, especially considering that a lot of these students, although they're coworkers, might not have worked with each other before, especially in a big company like New Relic. So some of them really weren't comfortable with each other yet. And giving people low friction, low stress opportunity to talk about trivial things was really good. It also helped the instructor, I hope, seem more approachable, less intimidating. And overall, it made the students more likely to be interactive later on, made them more likely to interrupt me with questions, which is great. Okay, the fourth principle, tech is really dry most of the time. We've got to do everything we can to make it more interesting and less dry. So we've all sat in on some kind of training class where there's a slide packed to the gills with 8-point text of obscure technical jargon on a PowerPoint template from the 80s. And the instructor just drones in a monotone and reads exactly what's on the slide. And that is just the worst training experience ever. So you really want to do everything you can to avoid that. And the solution we landed on was move outside of technology whenever possible. When you're giving examples, make them fun, make them real worldy, make them relevant. Don't just have them be more code. So for example, if I asked students to find out using a REST API, what's the exchange rate between Swiss francs and Chilean pesos, that's going to stick in their head more than asking them to find out what the cache invalidation timeout value is for a Postgres instance. So we tried to keep things real and interesting. Now with API training, that's surprisingly easy because there are a lot of really fun, weird, wacky APIs out there. For example, we were able to find a Star Wars API and ask students to figure out how much Yoda weighs. Or a lot of people in Portland commute by bike. So we found a weather forecast API and asked people to figure out what the bike commuting forecast for tomorrow was. So these real world examples, well, Yoda's not real world, but you know what I mean. These interesting examples go a long way toward making the subject less dry. The fifth principle is, let me take a step back and say one of the standard ways of training is what I'll call the fire hose approach, where the instructor just blasts you with every bit of information they know about a subject. And that's not as terrible as it sounds in some cases. If the audience is fairly technical themselves and they're looking to fill in some gaps in their knowledge, that fire hose approach is actually a pretty good way to go. But most of the time it isn't. And when training technical writers, it almost never is the right approach. I prefer an approach that makes use of something called the Pareto Principle. So the Pareto Principle was invented, I don't know, 2 decades ago maybe, by a management consultant who noticed that 80% of a company's profits come from 20% of that company's clients. And he named the principle after this finely bearded gentleman who is an Italian economist, Vilfredo Pareto. These days, it's often referred to as the 80-20 rule. So we mentioned profits and clients, but it turns out the 80-20 rule applies all over in life, and it especially applies in technology. In my experience, knowing the first 20% of a programming language or a framework or whatever technology, Vim commands, whatever it is, knowing the first 20% really gets you through 80% of your work. Most of the time, that's all you need to know. And learning more than that, or training someone in more than that initial 20%, becomes, you quickly hit a point of diminishing returns. So another aspect of this is once you know the first 20% of a technology, you're sort of equipped to teach yourself the remaining bits that you need to know. So think of an analogy in learning a foreign language, a spoken language, not a computer language. If you learn the first 20% of a language, however you define that, then when you run across a vocabulary word that you don't know, you can usually figure it out from context by looking at the words around it. Or the same thing's true for a grammatical principle that you don't understand, or a verb tense or whatever. If you know the first 20%, you can sort of self-instruct on the rest. And I found that the same thing is true often in technology. So an example from the New Relic training is REST APIs have, 15 or so verbs that you can use with the REST API, request types. And I only taught the 4 big ones, the get, post, put, and delete verbs. If you know those 4, that takes you 80% of the way through using a REST API. Frankly, it probably takes you 98% of the way through using a REST API. That's really all you need to know. And if you do happen to run across a new verb, like say the patch verb, it's easy to learn it if you already know one of those 4 initial ones. You say, oh, I see, patch is for updating just a part of a record, just like put is for updating the entire record. That makes sense to me. So you can self-teach more easily. The 6th principle is similar to the Pareto principle. And this is the idea that it's important for an instructor to kind of constrain or draw a boundary around the content that the student needs to know. So when you're learning a new technology, it's usually a vast landscape of knowledge. This goes back to the imposter syndrome question that we were talking about earlier. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this stuff out there that you're supposed to know. And if an instructor can come in and say, no, slow down, you don't need to know all of it. You need to know this chunk of it, this 20%. That can be really sort of liberating. And not everyone needs that kind of encouragement. So for example, think of someone who's just beginning to learn guitar, and they learn 3 chords, and they learn 1 strumming pattern, and then they're ready to jump on stage at the open mic night at the neighborhood cafe. Not everyone is that bold. Most people would say, oh, I need to learn some more strumming patterns. I need to learn 12 more chords before I'm ready to perform. I'm not there yet. Same thing is true with language learning. But when it comes to technology, it's surprising sometimes how little you need to know to get your job done. So I think if an instructor can draw a boundary around the content that the students need to know, that can really inspire confidence in the students. It can make them feel empowered, like I actually can be productive now. As I've already mentioned a few times, it reduces imposter syndrome. And it really reduces the paralysis you feel from feeling overwhelmed by how large the field is or the technology is that you're learning. So how does this apply at the New Relic class? Well, I tried to make very clear that, hey, if you guys know how to use a simple weather forecasting API, you know how to use 80% of the APIs out there, or you can easily learn 80% of the APIs out there. Similarly, if you can read and understand the documentation for that weather forecast API. That means you can probably write it as well. And then that means you can read and write documentation for 80% of the APIs out there. And that's plenty. You know enough, trust yourself, go forth and use it. Multimodal learning. Now, usually when people use this phrase multimodal learning, they're talking about the fact that some students learn better visually from seeing things written out, things like diagrams. Some students learn best from hearing, like a lecture, and some students learn best from reading. But, and that's true, I don't disagree with any of that. But I have something slightly different in mind. I'm thinking that students really can cement their understanding. In fact, the only way to cement their understanding is when they learn about something, and then they get a chance to use it, to do that thing. And then third, they get a chance to explain it. I think doing those three things, especially doing those three things over and over again, is really the only way to really, really learn something well. Now, a lot of courses, a lot of instructors focus way too much on the first of those three legs of the three-legged stool, the learn it part. And that's because it's easy to just stand up in front of the class and lecture at them. That's, again, the low-effort approach. But I think it's important that instructors also emphasize the do it and explain it parts. So the do it solution, both at New Relic and most classes that emphasize the do it part, takes the form of labs. So we had frequent small labs. I think it's really important for them to be small and for them to happen often. The explain it part is really hard to include in teaching, but it's also important. You really don't understand something well unless you can explain it clearly yourself. And if you don't believe me, take some technology that you feel competent in. Git is a good example if you're a Git user. And try to explain the basics of Git to someone who's completely unfamiliar with it. And my bet is that you'll be amazed how many gaps in your own knowledge you expose just from trying to explain it. So figuring out how to have students practice this explain it part is tough, because if you just ask them to explain something back to you, it feels like you're testing them, and nobody likes that, understandably. So at the New Relic class, what we did instead is we had one student try to answer questions that other students posed. So if Michelle, for example, had a question, rather than me just jumping in and trying to answer it myself, we saw if anyone else in the class could answer it. And that's great, because that not only does that build up the confidence in the student who's answered, but they get to kind of show off the knowledge that they've learned in the class. And also, frankly, Michelle probably will learn more and remember better if something's explained by one of her coworkers than coming from me. Now, this learn it, do it, explain it sequence ideally should be repeated more than once. The more often you repeat it, the better. There's a concept in spoken language learning called overlearning, which sounds like a bad thing, but in fact, it's a good thing. Overlearning means you learn this part of the language so often and sort of repeatedly that it becomes a completely automatic thing. And it frees up your brain to think about constructing more complicated sentences in the language or dealing with kind of higher order problems. And the same is true with technical training. If you can have frequent labs that have a lot of overlap, maybe you're doing the same setup steps in each one of your labs, then that you can overlearn that concept, which means that you kind of don't have to think about it anymore. Your fingers just automatically do these initial setup steps, and you can worry about the more complicated parts of your technology. Okay, that is it for the 7 principles. Michelle, can I hand it back to you?
Through Chris's approach, we learned what we've needed all this time. We didn't have to feel like those scuba divers from the movie Open Water, floating, circled by sharks, no land in sight and nothing to hold on to. That usually sets in for me around day 3 of a 5-day class. Instead, we were really energized. I walked down the hall and ran into somebody from the class, and they were sort of elated. Directly after the class, I surveyed the participants, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Somebody said, "This is by far the best technical training I've ever had." Another person said, "The labs really reinforced what we were learning, and they built empathy for our end users." And that's obviously like the most significant takeaway. If we can actually feel like what our users need and feel while they're running the APIs, we can help to give them the information that they need. Um, and also, somebody said, Chris is great at encouraging interruptions and creating space for discussions. The training felt very interactive and responsive to the needs of the participants. And this gets back again to what Chris was saying. And, one of the things that struck me this time was listening to these principles was he really took his time and started from the beginning, and so that kind of created those boundaries that he talked about, where we didn't feel like we were kind of being thrown into the middle of an ocean of information and told to figure it out from there. We had lots of constructive feedback for Chris because we are, in fact, user experience professionals. But generally, the overall feeling was very, very positive. And then I followed up with folks a few months after the class to see, how are they using the training. Most said that they hadn't had to run any APIs yet, but the phrase that came up over and over again was that more confident. People felt that they were confident going into discussions about what needs to be included with their API docs, how our new Relic APIs work, and particularly how our flavor of GraphQL fits into the overall product landscape. Personally, this deeper understanding and the confidence that I gained from the class have meant that I've been asking more directed and particular questions when I'm documenting some APIs. And I enjoyed the learning. Like, I felt that I was actually getting somewhere. It was fun.
You've heard the principles, you've heard of what the class was aiming at, and you've heard the end result. So what's the takeaway for you? What's the whole point of this presentation? The point is that we've discovered that when it comes to training people to use, understand, and document APIs, training can work. It's genuinely useful. In this case, at least, it was. And recommend you try it as well, or at least consider trying it. However, it does work best if you don't accept prepackaged training that's generally aimed at engineers, because a lot of training is aimed at engineers. Think of an analogy with the deli sandwich here, the prepackaged sandwich that was made 3 days ago in some central kitchen 10 miles away, compared to the custom-made sandwich you get at the deli counter next door. Yeah, this is acceptable, the prepackaged training, but why would you go for that? The prepackaged sandwich, but why would you go for that if you can have a custom sandwich? And the same thing is true for training. So if you are considering training, we've got 7 bits of advice for you that are just a summary of those 7 principles. First of all, there are 2 things you need to tell the prospective trainer. One is, we are not engineers, so please deliver your training with that in mind. Consider your audience. Secondly, here are our interests. Here's what we want to learn. So please keep that in mind and don't teach us what you think we should know. Teach us what we think we want to know. And then you have 5 questions you should ask the prospective trainer. One is, how do you encourage low stress, low friction interactivity? Secondly, how do you keep dry technical material interesting? Third, what are the core concepts in this field that you teach? In other words, do you recognize and honor the Pareto Principle? Do you use the power of the Pareto Principle? Also, you want to ask, how do you draw clear boundaries around what you expect us to know and what we don't have to know? And then lastly, how do you make sure that the students don't just learn about these concepts, but they also get a chance to practice them in the class and get to explain them in the class? So it all boils down to this. When you're setting up any kind of training, whether it's for API training or anything else, make sure it works for you. Training is very expensive in terms of both money and, more importantly, the time of the students. So there's no reason not to make it the very best thing you can get, and make it sure it's exactly what your group wants and needs. And that is it for us.